Yeah, welcome everyone. We're going to start. I know most of you have been working behind your screen all day already, but we got an important topic to discuss that is worth some extra screen time, I would say. That is education and children's future society. My name is Jochem Kootstra. I will be your moderator this afternoon. And the name of this event is called When the Great Equalizer Shuts Down. Horace Mann, a pioneer of American public schools in the 19th century, famously called education the great equalizer of the conditions of man and found social harmony to be the primary goal of the school. But the inverse is also true, I would say. Students who receive a poor education can end up on the wrong side of a lifelong gap in employment, earnings, and even life expectancy. Too often, the difference of a life of promise and a life in peril hinges not on a student's potential, but on the quality and accessibility of the local public school. That means people have a choice to make, whether we will allow education to be a wedge that widens inequality or whether we will use this power, as Horace Mann envisioned it, to create opportunity for all. But now the great equalizer shuts down because of the current pandemic that we are in. There is no choice to make anymore. Schools have remained closed for long periods around the globe, depriving society of this powerful equalizing force of education accessible to all, as well as the harmonizing force of schools. Studies show that children from poorer families lose the benefit of mingling with others from a different background, whereas children from wealthier families now interact mostly with others from a similar advantaged background. We see profound differences in the impact on children in the poorest neighborhoods compared to the richest ones. Now, the speakers of today will tell you more about what this means for children's future regarding social and economic impacts. And together we'll try to find answers to questions like what are the consequences on children today and on future society? And can we close the learning gap that opened up, or will the consequences of the pandemic permanently mark the COVID generation? Well, in a bit, we start with Giuseppe Sorrenti, an assistant professor in economics. And in relation to the pandemic, he researched determinants of a child's development, the importance of non-cognitive skills in shaping life opportunities, and the implications of different parenting styles on the accumulation of children's skills. After that, Thijs Bol, associate professor in sociology, will talk about the impact of school closures, learning inequality, material differences, and also parental supports. And we'll end the presentations with a column by journalist Rosa van Gogh. And then, given all the evidence the speakers provide us today, we will discuss what we can do now and in the future. And we open up questions for you at home as well. Some practicalities, though, you can do that via the Q&A function in Zoom, because you stay muted during the whole event. I will sort them and pick them out and ask them for you. I think like at the end of maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And write for who the question is attended to in the chat, please. And then I will know who to ask it for. All right, so let's start. First speaker, Giuseppe Sorrenti. He is assistant professor in economics at the Amsterdam School of Economics of the University of Amsterdam. He recently published a paper on the effect of COVID-induced school closures on child development and equality of opportunities. And we will hear more on his research findings now. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with a few slides. Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction. Today, I'm gonna tell you something about my recent work of the effect of school closures induced by COVID on child development and their future life opportunities. Whatever I'm gonna say is based on research done with an amazing team of co-authors based in the US. So is school closure a widespread phenomenon? So this is the first very important question, and actually it is. Why we are interested in school closures? Because schools have been closed in many countries and for a very prolonged time. Here you can see that school closure is really a phenomenon affecting different countries in different ways, but the common thing is that you can really see that schools were basically closed everywhere. And it's still a problem. Actually, it is still a problem because in many countries, schools are still closed. Here you see that, for example, if you look at areas in purple, these are places in which schools are partially open. And you see that this is a common thing, both, for example, in the US, in Canada, but it's also happening in Europe, in the Netherlands, in Italy, and in other countries. So why school closures is important is it's very important because it might really create consequences for an entire generation of students. This is from today's version of today's edition of New York Times, and you really see that school closures have failed Americans' children. So it's really an hot topic that we should try to understand in order to try to understand what we can do in order to limit the consequences for children. Why school closure are important and why they can really affect not only children now, but also in their future life opportunities. Because school closure promise to have a large impact on the making of future society, and in particular, they risk to threaten, so they threaten widen inequality, not only across cohorts, but also across socioeconomic groups. So COVID and school closures are not going to affect children from different socioeconomic backgrounds in the same way. And this is true because learning should be considered as a cumulative process, as a dynamic process. And so basically what I learned today is something that is going to help me in learning more tomorrow. If one of these steps is interrupted for different reasons, the consequences are going to be long-term consequences. And so we have to think of these effects of the disruption as effects that will persist over time and will carry over their effects on future success in labor market, family formation, health-related outcomes, and crime. And you can think of this as powerful multiplier of inequality. So for this reason, we decided to study this topic and to use the tools of economics and an economic model and empirical data to try to understand how the impact of COVID and school closure is going to affect the life of an entire generation of students and children. And in our paper, we take three different perspectives. We consider three important actors. The first is schools. Schools are going to be closed, and this is going to basically mean that there is going to be a switch from in-person teaching, for example, to online teaching with consequences in terms of child development. The second important actor are parents. And you have to take into account that obviously parents are very important actors in the child development process in standard times, but they become even more important in a period in which schools are closed, in which they basically have to substitute teachers. And the third channel that is sometimes is a little bit neglected is the channel operating through peers. Closing schools means basically imposing kids to stop meeting their friends, to stop going to school and improve their socializing skills. And this is an important effect that should be taken into account when we want to analyze the overall effect of school closures on child development. So let me tell you what are the main ingredients in our model, and in particular, what we think and what we model in our study that are the changes in pandemic times. We take, first of all, the perspective of children. So the first important ingredient when it comes to understanding the effect of pandemic times and the effect of school closures is to take into account the falling productivity of skill formation technology. So knowing class activity, everything switch, or at least a considerable part of teaching switch to online teaching. This is not a perfect substitute for in-person teaching. Not all kids have the same opportunities when it comes to do online teaching, because online teaching depends on availability on internet connection or on devices that can be used in order to do online teaching and so on and so forth. And this is just to show you what's actually going on in the Netherlands. So is it true that there is a learning loss when it comes to close schools and to switch to forms of alternative teaching? This is the case of the Netherlands. This is a case in which the Netherlands were very prepared in terms of online teaching. So the internet connection is extremely good, and teachers were somehow better than in other countries, better prepared than in other countries in switching to online forms of teaching. Despite of this, in a framework without any kind of learning loss. This is a study done in the Netherlands after the first 8 weeks lockdown in April by Engel, Frey, and Verhagen. And what they basically show is that if we compare this performance of children in 2020 with respect to previous cohorts in the previous years, we basically see that we should expect a zero effect if there were no learning losses. Actually, there were considerable learning losses for Dutch students due to the school closure induced by the COVID pandemic. And these school losses, as you can see here, were more pronounced for kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Just to give you a number, we can say that the learning losses accounted to 20% of the standard skills that children acquire of during a normal school year. The second important channel that we have to take into account when it comes to children is the loss of contact with some friends. So children suddenly stop to go to school, and this has important consequences because they stop to meet their friends, they stop to improve their socializing skills, and there can be obviously important consequences for their skill accumulation process, both for what concerns cognitive, but also non-cognitive or soft skills. And the third one is changes in peer environment. If school closed, it changes the social environment each child is exposed to. This is for the case of US, just to give you an idea why the school closure might have very different consequences about by socioeconomic background of children. What happens when schools are closed, that your new social environment starts to be the neighborhood, so basically where you live. And here you can see that when you move from the left to the right on the x-axis, on this axis here, you find children that come from more advantaged backgrounds. What happens is that when you are from a more, let's say, a less advantaged neighborhood, for example, so this part of the graph, you see that switching from school to neighborhood implies that you're going to expose to peers with lower level of skills. And this is induced by the fact that schools are an equalizer, but they are also a place in which kids from different backgrounds are usually mixed up in order to decrease initial levels of inequality. If we move to very advantaged neighborhoods, we actually see that when we move from school to neighborhood, that's because this is due by residential segregation. This means that kids start being exposed to even better peers during the pandemic because the new social environment for them is their neighborhood. And usually because of residential segregation, children tend to meet more children with their similar background, with a background similar to their background. For parents, what's going to change because of the pandemic? First of all, there is a new demand or the time imposed by the need of replacing teachers. So suddenly parents need to become the teachers for their kids even more than in standard times. And this is subject to different extent of flexibility. So it's not for all parents, it's not the case that all parents have the same possibilities and opportunities when it comes to move from in-person work to online working and to invest time in their child development. And here I just want to show you two important facts, again, about the US, but this is very typical also of European countries. So first of all, here I compare the situation pre-COVID and during the COVID crisis for what concerns childcare time in hours per day. So this is the average amount that parents pre-COVID were devoting to activities such as childcare or homeschooling for their kids. And the average was 1.25 hours per day per parent. During the COVID, this average has increased to about 5.8. So basically there is high demand on parents for their time in order to teach children and to help children with homework, with homeschooling, and so on and so forth. But the second aspect that I want to show you is that not all parents were able to respond to the new demand for time in the same way. And here again, the x-axis is showing you the family income, and you see that the parents that were most responsive and were able to invest more time and to respond more to the COVID crisis were those parents with high family income. The response for those parents for low family income was lower because for those parents, basically, it was much more complicated to switch to forms, for example, of online work. So this is the case that I was showing you is about the US, but this is also the case for many other countries. And I don't want to spend too much time because the next speaker, Taj, is going to show you very interesting results about the case in the Netherlands and the inequality in homeschooling during the Corona crisis. So the third channel that affects what parents do during the pandemic is that they respond to changes in peer environments. And so what they do, they basically can interfere or more or less to the choices made by their friends, by their children, as they know that now their children are going to be exposed to a new social environment. So these are the three ingredients that we consider in our model. So to show you what we find in our model, we use all this empirical evidence and our model in order to try to estimate what are going to be the consequences induced by a one-year COVID shock. So we assume that the COVID shock is going to be more or less, is going to last 1 year. And this is the result, the main result of the paper that I want to describe. So this is the effect of the school shutdown on learning. On the y-axis here, you have the effect of COVID shutdown on children's skills. Remember that here, the shutdown is just going to last 1 year. So it means 1 year with school closed. That is very close to what's happening right now in the US. And then we want to see how this effect is going to change according to the socioeconomic characteristics of children. And in particular, the left part of the x-axis is going to represent the case of kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds, neighborhoods in this case, and the right part of this axis is gonna be the case of children for more advantaged frameworks and socioeconomic background. And let me show you what's going to happen. This is what we find. We basically find that those kids from more disadvantaged neighborhoods, the ones with lower resources, the ones with parents that can respond less to the demand of time implied by the outbreak of the pandemic, are the ones that experience very large negative effects induced by the COVID shock. On the other hand, what you can observe is that for those kids coming from very advantaged neighborhoods, actually the effect is very small, or it's even zero or positive for some of them, because they have parents with many resources to substitute for teachers, they have better internet connections, they have better extra schooling activities that can be done at home, they are exposed to better peers in their neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. So in this framework, just to give you an idea of the effect size implied by our results, this effect here that I was showing for the 20% kids from poorest neighborhood in the data that we analyzed, if you take grades from A to D, this effect size that we find in our paper implied a change from straight B to getting C in half of the subjects for those kids coming from the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. Remember that the effect is close to zero for those from more advantaged backgrounds. So you understand that in a situation in which there is already initial inequality, the COVID shock, it's very likely to hit in a very unequal way kids according to their socioeconomic background. So this is going to hamper even more inequality in the future. As a final step in our exercise, we say, okay, what's going to happen if school after 1 year are going to open again and are going to act again as an equalizing factor in our society? And here you can see, basically the line here is showing what's going to happen. Again, the school is going to do a very great job in trying to equalize a bit the situation, trying to mitigate the consequences of the pandemic, but still for kids from more disadvantaged background, the overall effect of the COVID shock is going to be negative. And in particular, 50% of the gap is going to persist, of the gap in inequality created by the shock induced by the COVID-19 pandemic and school closure is going to persist over time, 50% of the initial gap. Again, this is a case in which we assume a 1 year shock, COVID shock. So thank you very much for your attention. You can find more material on this work. You can find the paper and more material about my research on my personal website.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Quite disturbing information. If you have questions, please do so via the Q&A, and we'll handle that later on during the discussion at the end. But we move on to Thijs Bol. Thijs Bol is Associate Professor in Sociology at the University of Amsterdam and member of the Jonge Academie at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Science. You may also know him as one of the initiators of the newly outbreak management team for education. Thijs, welcome.
Yes, thanks everyone. I hope you can all hear me, I guess so. Yeah, so thanks for this invitation. Giuseppe, a very interesting paper. Actually, I already saw the paper when it came out, so I'm very happy that we're together because, of course, I did something else that is, I think, part of this research agenda, but is slightly different. So in March, or when the schools closed, I, as a sociologist interested in inequality in education, in inequality in learning, of course, was a bit worried because I have two young kids, which means that I couldn't work that much. But I was also partly excited because this would offer an enormous opportunity for science interested in education and inequality in education, to understand the importance of the school. Because we all have this idea that school is super important, that that it's indeed a great equalizer, that it's sort of the one of the most important institutions in society. But of course, it's very difficult to analyze because the school is always there. So what happens when the schools close and when parents take over? Now, for the reasons that Giuseppe has already mentioned, it didn't really look that promising. Because we know that parents are very differently equipped to homeschool their children. So in March, I was very interested in that practice of homeschooling, and I will get to that study. But first, I will briefly go over the key results that Giuseppe already mentioned. Because a few months ago, three sociologists from Oxford analyzed how much students learned, children in primary education learned during the first lockdown in March and April. And the results were alarming, so very little learning, and Giuseppe already said it, and in fact much stronger from children from low educated parents. And this 20% learning loss basically meant, that's what they estimate, basically means that on average kids didn't learn anything in mathematics, in writing, in reading during this first lockdown. Right, so the first lockdown was 8 weeks, and 20% of school year is also 8 weeks, so almost stagnation. And of course, very worrying. The effect was much stronger for children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, about 1.5 times as big. Okay, so the question is then, of course, why? And this is where my study came in. And so the order is, of course, different because I started studying the why question already in April during the first lockdown. And when I was reading newspapers in this first lockdown, I was reading the Volkskrant, and you always saw these pictures of families working and homeschooling very like in pure harmony. Basically, these two kids wearing a onesie, and then this mother is working. It's all very quiet. Father is helping, and everything is going very well, very smooth. But of course, that's not reality for most of us. At least it wasn't for me. And so for most kids, for some kids, it might have looked like this. This is a scene from the documentary series Klasse. They also filmed during this first lockdown, and this is Vera. Vera lives in a very small apartment. I think it was 60 square meters, with two brothers, one brother and one older brother. And they were all working in the same living room, and Vera had to work and follow her online education, while her younger brother, who was not in school yet, was standing on his head in a Spider-Man outfit. And I think that's more a realistic image of how things went down. But of course, many things are going on here, right? So in these two photos, on the one hand, you see the father in the left-hand photo clearly helping, instructing his kids, right? So there's something going on there. And they also have like a very nice and bright, spacious room where they're all working. They are at the same table, but probably not necessarily, because they're also a separate room where they can work. They have their own bedroom. And then you see the other photo where Vera is basically, sitting on a couch. Her father is not instructing her right now. There's also a lot of noise and disturbances. So my question at that time was, to what extent is there inequality in homeschooling? And will this inequality in homeschooling also lead to differences in educational performance? And I focused on basically two things, and I will go over them, and then I will round off for the discussion. So first, I looked at material differences. right? So some parents have bigger houses, have more laptops, have such a spacious house that kids have their own bedroom. And so I looked if there was a difference between parents that were more in poverty versus parents that were richer. And so what you then see is quite a big gap. So this is on sort of a poverty scale. But what you see here is that, not surprisingly, of course, I mean, it's not very surprising, but anyway, it is important that when parents have less material resources with respect to money, kids are less likely to have their own bedroom, kids are less likely to have their own computer in primary education or laptop. And there's also a difference in the workspace, although that difference is not so big. Now, these effects don't seem that big, but they're still sizable, right? So this means a 7 percentage point difference in having your own bedroom. Given that lots of kids have their own bedroom, that is a big difference. And in secondary education, similar pattern comes up. We don't find it that, I don't find it that strongly for computers. Mostly because in secondary education, there are plans for children from disadvantaged families to give them computers. But again, less often a quiet workspace and less often their own bedroom. So these material differences are there and they're important. But I think what my study showed, my research showed, is that if we think about what's going on with inequality in learning, the results from that paper, that Oxford paper that Giuseppe also mentioned, is that it's really a lot about parental support. And there are huge differences in the extent to which parents, at least, reported themselves to be able to support their children with their schoolwork. So if we take a look at primary education, and here we see the difference between higher and lower educated parents. Higher means university, and lower means secondary, maximum of secondary education, vocational. So people with VMBO, basically. What we see here is that parents from parents with higher educational background helped their children much more often. We also find some evidence that they check their homework more often. But most importantly, they felt themselves much more capable to help. Right. So what we see is that in primary education, parents with higher educational backgrounds, they help more often, and they felt much more capable to help their children. And this has nothing to do with the perceived importance of education, because there's hardly any difference in the extent to which parents find education for their children important. Lower and higher education parents find it important, but they just have different resources to support their children. In secondary education, these effects are even stronger. So we find no difference between low and high educated when it comes to the extent to which parents check their homework or find it important that they do their homework during this lockdown. But we do find a very big difference in the extent to which they actually reported to help their children, right? And most prominently, again, parents with a lower educational background were just much less capable or felt much less capable to support their children with their schoolwork. And I think one of the most telling figures is this figure for secondary education, where you actually see the item that I used. Do you feel capable to help, yes or no? The blue bars are parents with high levels of education. The orangey red bars are parents with low education. And you see this enormous difference, right? And this is across secondary education. For kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, lower educated backgrounds in the highest track in VWO, these differences were even larger. Okay, so what happens when the schools close? Well, when the schools close, parents are more important for learning. And when parents become more important, inequality increases. Now, this is all happening still a bit. Secondary schools are now reopening, primary schools are open, but we had a second lockdown with another set of weeks. So the key question for now, I think, and I would be very interested also to hear your ideas, Giuseppe, but also other participants, in how can we prevent adverse effects? What can we now still do to help these children that have learned less, not because they didn't want to, and not because they weren't able, but because they had the bad luck to be born in a family where parents couldn't support them. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Thijs. Let's ask that question at the discussion to Giuseppe. We move on to something a little bit different with Rosa van Gol. Roos van Gogh is a journalist with a background in classics and education. She covered education as a contributing editor for De Groene Amsterdammer and now works as a foreign correspondent for the Volkskrant from Rome. Rosa, I'm curious about your column. Let's hear it.
Thank you. Also, thanks to the speakers before me. As the moderator said, I'm a bit different. I'm not a scientist, I'm a journalist, and I want to reflect a little bit on the problem of school inequality in a broader sense from three experiences. My experience as a reporter, my experience as a teacher of classics at two Dutch elite grammar schools, and my experience as a student on one of these schools, another one, a third one even. And I want to address today two taboos, I think, in Dutch education that are preventing us from progress. And one is a more conservative political taboo, I would say, and the other one is a more progressive cultural, if you like, taboo. And I think we should use the pandemic to address these and to finally, after decades, get them out of the way in order to make some progress. The first, most obvious, most persistent taboo is our notorious system of early selection, which in the Netherlands we do at the age of 12 years old. While we know from science that streaming students at this age is a terrible way to offer the same chances to students regardless of their backgrounds, and this is a well-known fact, and it has sparked an ongoing debate since as early as the 50s, and many left-wing politicians have attempted to change it, and so far no one has succeeded because of a lack of support. And this is why I called it a conservative taboo, though I have to say that there has also been opposition from the left itself. For example, the famous example of the leader of the Dutch Communist Party, Marcus Bakker, of all people. It was he who in the 70s objected to merging the different school types up until the age of 15, 16, when it was attempted by the labor minister Van Kemenade, because this communist leader said, now that the working class kids finally can go to the elite grammar schools, it's not fair to abolish them. Well, this shows a little bit how much of a taboo this is all along the political spectrum, yet I think this period offers us a unique chance to tackle this really constructional flaw in our system. Now that everything is already turned upside down, because let's be honest, this is never going to be a painless or a simple transition, albeit a necessary one. And postponing selection and streaming in the Netherlands to the age of 15, 16 will especially affect the type of grammar schools, the gymnasia where I went and where I taught as well, because it means they will have to open their doors to a much wider, more diverse range of pupils, and they will have to accept students who are not going to study Latin and Greek. This would mean the end of this kind of school as we know it. And I have to admit that as a classicist and a former pupil, it does pain me a little bit. My friends who are classics teachers won't like me for it, but I still think this is one necessary part of our educational transition. It doesn't just go for the grammar schools, by the way, it goes all over the political spectrum, or all over the educational spectrum. Let me now quickly move to the second taboo, which is a more progressive one, and I think it's also doing a lot of harm, and it doesn't play so much on a systemical level like the streaming, but it plays on a micro everyday level of the classroom, and it's something that as a reporter I encountered a lot. And it's the Dutch idea that school is most beneficial and most equitable when all pupils have as much individual freedom as possible and can pursue their own interests without too much hierarchy or interference. This sounds as a lovely progressive ideal, but does in practice quite a bit of harm. You also see it now with the pandemic. It's probably very well intended when parents or even teachers argue that there is no such thing as learning loss and children learn a lot at home and there's no such thing as backlog. What does that even mean? It's very well intended, but it's also a rather privileged view of school, because in fact, researchers told me that especially children with lower economic status benefit from a structured educational environment where there is an emphasis on core skills like reading, math, writing. This is a rather boring truth, and it's not in line with sexy progressive ideals, I know, but unfortunately, it appears to be true. And after COVID, there will be a huge amount of backlog and missed work to catch up. especially regarding core skills. And I think Dutch schools should dare to take this opportunity to actually go back to these basics without being afraid to come across as boring or conservative or overly strict. The pandemic, with all its terrible consequences, also poses us, I think, a unique opportunity, a window of opportunity in which even the rusty and rather conservative world of Dutch education has been turned upside down. So let's not miss this chance to reform both our educational system and our educational culture. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rosa. Yeah, let's start a discussion. I think all speakers can turn on their video again. Yes, there you are. Welcome. Well, maybe Thijs, Giuseppe, respond to Rosa's ideas about, changing the basics of our conservative school system.
I mean, I can respond to this, but it won't be a very exciting discussion because I mostly agree with Rosa, I have to say. So I think particularly the second point is something that struck me as very surprising in the sense that as I actively contributed to the debate on learning loss, that at some point there was this discussion that you shouldn't talk about learning loss, right? Because it would harm the children, and it was very important that children would just, don't feel stressed and just be relaxed. And then, I was just thinking about all this scientific literature that was piling up that was showing that these learning losses were very big and they were very unequally distributed. And so that means that, I was a bit uncertain what would give stress. If we would really try to make this point now, we should really do something about this, try to help them, or just let them relax. And then in 3 years, they will be in a different place than where they should have been. But it's okay. You can just be happy if you want to. I mean, people who say this are mostly people who have, indeed, as Rosa say, the privilege to say this. They have a big enough house to live in. They have had a secure job and probably a burnout, and then came up with some spiritual way to their happiness. And so, but many people don't have that, right? They are might have been unemployed or whatever. They might have been school dropouts, and I think it's very important to keep this in mind. So I mostly agree with that.
Yeah. And Giuseppe, from your experience, I mean, you don't live here in the Netherlands, of course, but maybe similar things happening in Italy or anywhere else.
Yeah, I totally agree with what was said by Rosa and Thijs. So I think that obviously it's very difficult to deal with this situation. We can discuss a bit about potential solutions to what's happening right now, but I think there is also something good in what's happening, or something that can turn to something good in for the future, let's say. And it's really about rethinking a bit the kind of inequalities. So we were mentioning at the very beginning Horace Mann. So the question about having schools have a great equalizer in our society. So the question is how schools and school systems are doing when it comes to equalizing the kind of situation that we see in our society. So I think that it's good that we now try to focus maybe on short-term solutions to try to mitigate what's going on, but at the same time would also be important to start thinking a little bit more broadly on the whole education system. And many of the things that were mentioned would also apply to the system I'm more used to, that is the Italian one.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we go back to Thijs' question for you, like how to prevent adverse effects.
Yeah, that's a sort of 1 million question, because it's obviously not easy. So what we can do, we can use the existing evidence from different fields to try to understand what can be done to mitigate at least the effects. So I think that it's extremely important to take into account that we don't want to sort of neglect the trade-off between keeping schools open and the situations in terms, for example, of the spread of the virus and the contagion. So what I want to say is that there are now some studies that basically start showing that the benefits of reopening schools might be actually larger than the cost of keeping schools closed. So it looks like, for example, there is a new study by the Journal of the American Medical Association that shows that if schools are reopened in, let's say, in a smart way, by ensuring, for example, forms of social distancing, forms of ventilation, this can sort of, there are ways to basically prevent the contagion to go up and to sort of there are ways to avoid bad health outcomes related to school opening. So the first thing that I would stress is that we should try to do our best to reopen schools. If we are not able to completely reopen schools, we should think of those parts of the population, we should think of forms of targeted education. So if it's not open to open schools for everybody, maybe we should start thinking on how to select groups of students that are the ones that risk to be they face a very high risk to be left behind due to the crisis. And there are different things that can be done. One thing that can be done, for example, is to consider to shorten the next summer breaks. So it's so important to ensure some schooling. We should consider, especially in countries like Italy, in which there are 3.5 months of summer breaks, it would be probably important, and actually is one of the points that is currently debated in Italy, is whether we should try to have a little bit shorter summer break in order to try to recover the months that we have lost because of school closed. And then the other thing is to provide services to parents. Also, when the crisis is going to be a little bit, let's say, it's gonna look better in terms of the healthcare in case of for what concern health related outcomes. We should go more for subsidized childcare and subsidized forms of alternative schooling, because this is going to help parents to deal with a very difficult situation that is going to be prolonged over time. So it's not going to be that this is going to last for years, probably decades. If you read the article today in the New York Times, they see that the consequences of this for children are going to be visible until 70 years, for the next 70 years.
At least we have something to do as researchers for the next 70 years on the positive side. But I think one, I want to connect to those, because I think your second point, Rosa, is really interesting, that this perspective, and I think it's also dominant in the didactics, in the pedagogical view on teaching. And so one of my worries is that we have all these ideas, and Giuseppe's pointing, we can do summer schools, we can do learning, we have ideas on what might work. But I do think that sort of the vision that many people who work in schools have is so different from that's not the goal from school, that's not the goal from learning, that even if there now in the Netherlands there is a huge amount of money that will be pushed into the system, that I'm actually quite worried if it will be used to account for the learning loss, or if it will be used for all kinds of other things that fit this idea of children should be happy and so on, that don't really help them in the long run, because we selected 12 years, so and then they will be put into one of the few categories that they can't get out of, and it will determine their lives.
Yeah, if I can say something to that, it's one of the things that I notice most when speaking and attending as a reporter going to different Dutch schools, is that the field of education is highly individualistic, and there's very little common ground in the Netherlands about what entails good education. So of course you have the more traditional school that says, so I'm talking primary schools now, that are putting a lot of focus on learning how to write, learning how to read, doing math, and really put this in the core. But there's a whole wide range of schools that are departing from a very different perspective. And I think if there's so little consensus about this, that this will really be a problem also in how to spend this money. So I think it should be one of the priorities of actually Dutch teachers to find some common ground. And this is a very difficult thing that I've written about a lot, because it's also hard to unify teachers. I mean, you can unify them for some things like better working conditions, better salaries, but as soon as it goes about what education should be, you see that it's a very fragmented group. So I think this should be one of the priorities, to sort out what do we want from education, what do we want to offer, and not necessarily optimistic, but if there's a time to do it, it should be now, especially with these big investments, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And Thijs, I mean, you initiated an outbreak management team for education. Now that we have, I think correctly, 8.5 billion for education, and do you advise now? What do you advise at this point?
we just started, right? So we will meet on Thursday. But the idea is that we will advise, that we will provide schools, if they want to, with ideas on how they might spend this money most efficiently, depending on the goal that they have, right? So if they, I don't know, if there's been a huge loss in reading, what are programs that you can use that we at least have some idea of that it might actually improve learning? So to give an example, one thing that I'm a bit worried about now, I watched the debate this afternoon between the Minister of Education and the Parliament. And so there it became clear to me that all schools have to offer something this summer. And that sounds good, right? So schools can offer something this summer, but what it will do for kids completely depends on what they will offer. So if you go play basketball and make art and stuff, that's all nice. That's a nice activity, and kids might feel happy, but they won't do anything with their learning. So if you really want, use this money to combat a loss in mathematics and loss in reading, then you need to do some programs that we know actually work. And so that's something we, I think, can advise on. On the other hand, I think it's also a sheerly impossible task, to be honest, to do this, given the time frame, 2.5 years, and the huge problem of good teachers to provide these courses, right? So basically, there's this pile of money, and I think schools will have difficulties in spending it in an efficient way. And that's really a pity. I think that now all of a sudden there is money for education. It's not structural, it's incidental. It has to be spent in 2 years. So, that was one of the key reasons for us to do this, to hope to contribute something in schools making decisions that are slightly better, or maybe more lead to more improvement for kids in this very short time frame.
If I can add something to it, I agree that's a risk, and without wanting to be overly cynical, I've also, as a reporter, seen a lot of companies that are on the sideline of education, that are providing, courses for teachers or activities for schools. And I mean, this is always a risk when you're going to invest. How are you going to invest it in a way, especially with incidental money, that it's not going to be, sucked out by these sideline players who probably have good intentions as well, but are not really structurally going to improve the system. So, yeah.
Yeah, Giselle, what you think about that?
I think that it's very difficult to try to come out with general ideas that can be applicable everywhere. So when I was listening to this, that is more about the Netherlands, a country that I'm discovering because I just moved 1 year ago, I see that maybe the problems are a little bit different with respect to the problem in my country. So because I'm from Italy, and for example, I think that now one of the main issue for us is how to be prepared and how to make this transition from something that was in person to something that is online, and maybe it's going to be online for the upcoming months, something more doable, a smoother transition somehow. So now in Italy, the discussion is really about how we can invest in the best possible ways in order to be more prepared to similar crises and to similar kind of situations. And for example, I just want to give you a number that I found extremely somehow not super optimistic, is that it came out that 1/3 of families in Italy, they have some problems when it comes to internet connection. So here you can immediately understand that it's obviously a problem that is completely different with respect to the Dutch case, for example, in which there was somehow preparation for this possible potential switch somehow. So I think that each country is going to face different challenges for how to deal with this crisis and what to learn out of this crisis. I think it should be something to prioritize in the coming months.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of pressure, more pressure on teachers coming up this coming years. I have some questions here in the Q&A that I want to ask you. So we go back a bit to the presentations. First one from Thijs, I quote, "Did you also consider whether parents were native speakers of Dutch or not in your study? This has been my limitation as a lockdown parent."
Yes, I looked at that. So to give a brief idea on this study, it was a random sample in an existing panel. And so I had 800 parents, something like that, and then different children for each of these parents. There were also non-native parents, and what you see there is that all of them found it more difficult to help their children, irrespective of whether they were from a country like the UK or the US, or a country like Morocco or Algeria or whatever, right? So irrespective of the country where you came from, all parents found it more difficult, and it just mostly has to do with communication, I guess. However, the group was not super big, so in my paper I didn't really put that much effort to it. But of course, communication is sort of key. And so if you don't speak the language, you also see in my results that there was hardly any good contact with teachers, with schools, that they didn't really know what was expected from them. And all these barriers have to be overcome when you want to school at home. And so for parents that don't speak Dutch, that is a barrier. But there's also parents that are sort of digitally illiterate, and they also hamper to do anything. They just couldn't open the software for their child to communicate with the class and so on. Yeah, so it's a good point, and so there are all these barriers. I do think one final point, and because I talk too long in life in general, is that I think the key finding for me is that most of these barriers are very unequally divided across groups. So mostly parents from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they had many more barriers. They were either digitally illiterate, or they didn't get the materials themselves, or they didn't speak the language. So many of these barriers are clustered in specific groups, and I think that's also what the research from the Oxford team shows.
And yeah, to give you a bit more speaking time, I have another question for you from me though. I mean, about the materials. I mean, I've read so much about children who don't have laptops, or what you said, like don't have Wi-Fi, and all of a sudden they sort of disappear. I haven't really read anything about that lately, but did you talk to families like that as well? I really wonder what happens to those.
Yeah, so the disappeared kids. I mean, of course, they didn't really disappear, right? It's not like they were gone. They were just at home, and no one could get contact with them.
Well, it feels like that for some people, right?
Yeah. I mean, for teachers, they really disappeared.
Yeah.
So my wife's a teacher, and in Amsterdam, and there were also in her class kids that she just didn't see for a very long time. It was unclear where they were, particularly during the first lockdown. The second lockdown was better. But so it's very difficult to monitor what happened to these kids, because it's very difficult to study them. If these kids are living in families that make their kids don't go to school, it's also very difficult to get any research data on them, be it qualitative or quantitative. So I mean, it's most likely they didn't learn anything. And there are stories where, for example, children had to go work because parents lost their source of income. And so kids in secondary education had to work at Albert Heijn during the day to make sure that there was still an income in the family, because the father was a taxi driver, and there were no rights anymore. So I mean, these stories are there, and I think this is a really precarious group that we know very little about still. But of course, in sort of the spectrum, who gets harmed most? And these kids that didn't even participate in the online education. I mean, yeah, that's a very very difficult group, I think, and this crisis will have huge effects for them.
Yeah, the dependence on technology, I find that quite disturbing. Giuseppe, question for you, a long one, so bear with me. You probably assume that teachers continue to teach as they did before the pandemic. Is this correct? If so, don't you expect that teachers after the closure adjust their teaching style and will target their teaching more to the most disadvantaged students whose development was most hindered by the school closure?
This is a very good it's a very good point. So basically, in our model, we don't have information about how teachers responded to the crisis. So what we assume that teachers, yes, they don't adjust much with respect to teachers. So it's not that they change in a positive way how they teach in order to increase, for example, the skills of more disadvantaged kids. So on this, what I want to stress is that it's true that one of the main actors of all our story and how these school closures are going to affect child development is relying on teachers and the role of teachers. So teachers are going to be extremely important. unfortunately, obviously, there is difference by country, so I don't want to generalize, but there is quite some evidence, especially, for example, if I consider my country, that teachers were completely unprepared, or at least largely unprepared, to the switch to online teaching. And on this, I want to report some numbers for the global campaign for education in Italy that basically ask teachers about their impression and how they have lived this change, this change to from in-person teaching to online teaching. And it's interesting, more than 80% of teachers reported that this was perceived as an historical change. So there was something that, like an historical change, they were not prepared. So they basically, more than 50% of them, they stated were completely unprepared or very unprepared to this switch. And they usually report two very important constraints. One is more of a knowledge constraint. So they basically were not trained to teach online. They were not trained to use some kind of technologies. Now we are using Zoom. These kind of technologies to teach were sort of new for many of them. Also, in the Italian case, some states that were not super willing to undertake this change because they were sort of not thinking this as the best thing to do. And then there is another one important constraint, that is the technological constraint. So again, you have to take into account that there are still some problems when it comes to internet connection, to the availability of devices, and this is really affecting differently children from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And also, when you look at the map, for example, for the case of Italy, of the availability of internet, you can see, for example, a very huge divide from the north and the southern part of the country. So it's true that in our model, we don't have data about teachers, but we don't think that there was an immediate reaction, at least in many countries, that was sort of in order to try to mitigate the possible effects, especially for those kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds.
Can I briefly respond to this, because very briefly, because I saw who asked the question, and and of course it was a very famous Dutch economist who asked this question, Erik, and so I remember when I published my study, there was another famous Dutch economist, Hessel Oostwijk, who responded that he thought that it would not be so bad, because schools would invest more with the learning on distance in children that were more disadvantaged. So it might be that they compensate for each other. I think, actually, to sort of answer this question that was not asked to me, to say, but I think in the Netherlands, I'm worried that it will actually be the other way around. That now there's this money that will go to schools. Schools can try to buy stuff from it, but we know that, for example, the huge shortages in teachers, they are clustered in schools where most disadvantaged kids are. So it's also these schools that was most difficult is in really trying to repair these kids. And of course, we're not living in a scenario where every school class has 4 kids that are disadvantaged and had huge learning loss. Now, some schools have all kids who didn't learn anything, and then there are schools who are doing pretty okay. And this makes it a huge challenge, particularly for these kids. So I'm actually worried that this disadvantage might actually increase because there's just no teacher time to invest in these kids, given the segregation and the clustering of them. And it's not just 1 or 2 kids in some classrooms, it's really 7 or 8 or 10 or 12. And then there's no teachers to do it. So I hope for the optimistic scenario that Erik is sketching here, but I'm actually quite pessimistic in the extent to which we'll be able to repair this in the coming years.
I agree on this. If I can add something, is that I agree with this possible interpretation, the possible story that should be tested, because this is just out of speculation. But if this is true, and I think it might be true, what we actually are, the effects that we are estimating might be actually a lower bound of the true effect. So the effect might be even worse because of this. And obviously, I don't want to blame that teachers are bad and they don't want to help children, but in many cases they face constraints, and there can be economic constraints, financial constraints, institutional constraints, and they do what they can do, obviously.
Yeah. All right, we have to round up. I do have one question, though. I mean, being optimistic or pessimistic, if you read programs of, I mean, the elections are coming up. If you read programs of our parties here in the Netherlands, makes it you pessimistic, optimistic? What do you think of it?
So I mean, one of the things that surprised me, to be very brief, what was Rose was talking about is early selection, and inequality of opportunity at all, right? It was something that mostly was not talked about in previous election programs. I think that inequality in education is now pretty high on the agenda, much higher than it was. That's partly due to the COVID crisis, but also because there's been several processes that have pointed this to the agenda. So I am actually quite hopeful, a bit hopeful. Not super hopeful because the biggest party, VVD, says very little about it and only wants to reward excellent teachers, which will do very little for inequality, but I'm still a bit hopeful.
Let me say that I want to be realistic. I think we are going to face a very important and very difficult challenge, but I hope that this challenge is going to be, let's say, the stepping stone to start a more broad discussion on how to improve the education system in many countries. So with differences by countries, but I think it's more or less a common problem.
Rosa?
Yes, I think we really have a chance in the Netherlands to, as I said before, to use this moment to break some cycles that we've been in for decades that keep popping up, like this streaming problem. So, I mean, it's not going to happen just out of the blue, come fall out of the sky, but it's a window of opportunity, and I hope we can use it.
All right. Hey, thank you, Giuseppe, Thijs, Rosa. Thanks a lot. And yeah, talk soon maybe. Cheers.
Thank you so much.